So let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Brandon Riley. I'm the Capital Projects Manager here at PPC, joined by Aaron Tobin and Jenny Withers, also at PPC, and Kara Rogenkamp from Pashik MTR, who is the designer on this project. We're very excited to present to you the preferred plan for the Frick Environmental Center sensory classroom. Before we dive in, just a couple meeting guidelines. We're going to ask that everyone stays muted. Just in case there are participants who need to use closed captioning. It just, the background noise can muddle things up. So just trying to keep captioning clear for folks who need it. If you do have a question or a comment or want to participate, you can raise your hand. You can use that function and we can call on you. So you can, ask for things to be repeated, whatever you need. Also, we're going to ask people to please use the private chat function if you have comments or questions that you want to put in the chat. The reason being, if anyone's using a screen reader, it will pick up on the chat room chatter as well, which can be confusing if there's other people talking at the same time. So if you have questions, comments, things that you want to contribute through chat, please send a private message to Erin Tobin and we'll take breaks or find times and she can read out your chat and we can discuss it. Agenda for today, we're gonna kind of do a project introduction or reintroduction, just in case this is your first meeting as part of the sensory classroom. We'll also share the feedback we received so far, both through online surveys as well as the last round of public engagement meetings we did when we presented concepts back in January, I believe. And then we'll present to you the preferred concept design that reacted to all that feedback and incorporated it into a single concept design for your review and feedback today. And then we'll have some time for discussion as well. So just kind of a quick recap of what this project is. The goal of the sensory classroom project is to create a series of outdoor sensory experiences. Right now, there are a number of spaces in and around the Frick Environmental Center that our staff currently use to do nature-based programming, sensory programming, but none of it's accessible. So there's a large group of people who are unable to participate in these activities, unable to get into Frick Park, unable to kind of enjoy the greater park itself. And this is a great asset. So the goal is to create a series of sensory experiences that help teach users about the natural world. And really use their senses, use sensory experience as kind of the driving mechanism for how people engage in nature. And the design is specifically going to be catered towards learners with exceptionalities, persons with disabilities, but also the general public as a whole. We want this to be a truly inclusive and accessible place. Next slide, please, Karen. So just some images of kind of the project area that we're talking about now, just to get you oriented. If you're familiar with the Frick Environmental Center, that's the big white building here where I'm currently in. At the end of what's kind of the current accessible campus or part of this project is the fountain, which is a very popular kind of location that, is a landmark that might help orient you. Moving into Frick Park is the lower nature play space where there's kind of some tables and a mud kitchen, and in the summertime a shade shelter where a lot of our educational programming, our camps, etc., run out of during the summer months. Going down the South Clayton Loop Trail, there's an entrance to the existing nature trail, which you can see some images here. It's a paved path. At one point, it was considered accessible, but it's fallen into a state of disrepair. It's no longer meets ADA guidelines. And then along that path is the observation deck, which is a very cool space. Again, not accessible, but a unique feature in Frick Park, and we'll talk about it a little more in a second. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of what these spaces look like right now, the nature play space where a lot of our educational programming is run out of is tucked up onto the meadow adjacent on Clayton Hill. So there's some enclosure spaces, some shade, but again, not accessible, not particularly inclusive either. So a lot of people can't really access this space the way it's currently designed. The nature trail winds through a forested area. It's a very good example of kind of the forest area in Frick Park itself. and got kind of an immersive forest experience, but again, not accessible. And the observation deck really provides a cool, unique vantage point. It gets you kind of up into the treetops, which is a unique space in the park itself, but it's not some of it's not to code, it's not accessible. So a large portion of people are missing out on these assets. And this just gives you some images of how these spaces are currently used. So there's more formal educational programming that the Frick Environmental Center runs, or PPC runs, that includes kind of nature-based programming, exploring nature, flipping tree cookies to see what's underneath them, as well as using the mud kitchen, but also a lot of informal things. Walking along the nature trail to see what you discover on your own, or just kids bouncing on logs and making use of things that are around for informal play. So we want to keep these experiences, but make them accessible to a larger portion of the population. And just giving you a sense of where we are in the process. We kicked this project off in October of 2022, where we spent a lot of time listening to the public, to accessibility advocates, educators, people with experience for autism, Down syndrome, et cetera, understanding what those user groups need, what their challenges are, and how they could engage in this space before we designed anything. We then developed concepts that reacted to that feedback and gave them different options for how these spaces could be laid out, what types of features they could have, and presented those through public meetings earlier this year. And now we're presenting a refined design, kind of what we're calling the preferred plan or the preferred concept that will, again, we'll ask for your feedback on how we're doing, but ideally we would have captured all of the feedback previously from the engagement that we've already done and present something that's hitting the mark or is where everyone wants to be. Next slide, please. And so some of the feedback we received so far, this slide really just gives an idea of who we've engaged with already. We have a standing advisory committee meeting that's made up of various members of city departments, but again, accessibility advocacy groups, disability advocacy groups who have been guiding this project all along. We've met them 3 times, I think, had 3 meetings with them. They also put us in touch with other focus group members in their networks that we had specific targeted meetings with to get some feedback from those folks, who turned us on to other individual stakeholders within their networks that we should discuss. We've met with 72 individual stakeholders, including an occupational therapy class at Duquesne University, who gave us some great feedback we weren't even considering prior to that. And then we've had a series of public meetings with 54 attendees during the course of 3 meetings that we had in early January or late January, and then over 200 public survey respondents, over half of which identified as having a disability or having someone in their household who had a disability. So a lot of engagement has happened already, and we've had a lot of good feedback that we're hoping to kind of present to you today. And I'll kick it over to Kara.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. So as you can see, we've gotten a lot of input, made a lot of progress, but we still have a ways to go, and we're really looking forward to hearing your feedback. So some of the feedback we've gotten so far, there are really kind of 4 main aspects that really came through with everyone we talked to. And the one at the top of the list is accessible pathways. That's something that this area of Frick Park, once you get past the Frick Environmental Center, kind of lacks and is really preventing people from using those areas. So paths that are smooth, that are stable, wide, reasonably flat given the topography, options for shorter or longer loops within the area, and making sure that everything's connected up. So starting from the place that people would arrive at the Frick Environmental Center, whether that's the parking lot or the drop-off area, all the way to the loop that they would use within the park. We also heard a lot of excitement about the potential features that could be along this trail to help enhance the wonderful natural environment. We heard pretty strongly that what is at Frick Park, the woods, the meadows, provide a wonderful sensory experience in themselves that's both calming and stimulating. And so we didn't want to include anything that would detract from that. But we also heard that people would like sensory enhancers and prompts, some fun activities and ways to use your senses in nature. And that we should be thinking, as Brandon mentioned, about a huge range of people, from the very young to the elderly, people with various abilities, and provide multiple ways of engaging with nature and through multiple senses. So every aspect of this design, we've tried to look at it from many different angles. And we heard also that it was important for many people, and especially children, to be able to use their senses in a really active way. So to be able to touch things and smell things and use your sense of balance and your sense of body and space. So we really wanted to broaden the understanding of what senses folks can use in these spaces and enjoy. But we also heard that if these places are not comfortable, they are not as usable. So aspects like shade, like having pathways that are wide enough for folks to pass and for larger groups, classes or groups of people out for a hike together. We heard from a teacher at the School for the Deaf that when people are using sign language, they need to be able to see each other, and that's difficult on a narrow path. So we tried to make, balance path widths with also preserving natural features. And we heard about things like having restrooms nearby, having resting areas with seating, and having different types of seating because different people are comfortable with different types of seats. And then finally, legibility was very important, and that really touches on a broad range of accommodations. Things as simple as, but also as complex as signs that might be provided along this inclusive sensory trail and spaces, wayfinding signs and informational signs, and understanding what kind of content is helpful for people. But it may start actually way before that, when people are visiting, say, the Parks Conservancy's website to try to understand whether the space is going to be accessible to them. So we've been thinking about lots of different ways to make that kind of information as useful and inclusive as it can be. And I'm going to try to go to the next slide here. So I will just kind of breeze through the two design options that we developed and presented back in January. We've since combined these or consolidated them into a single concept based on the input that we received. Again, to just sort of orient you to the plan on my screen, the Frick Environmental Center is over here, the parking is up here, the drop-off and long access to the fountain is here. So in concept one, this was the first option that we looked at. The existing nature play area was modified a little bit with providing this loop that went through the meadow with some pullout spaces. There was a gathering space under a shade arbor and a fenced area enclosed around it for this larger area under the oak trees here. And then lower down at the nature trail, we presented in this option one alignment of that trail, which had a larger loop with some features of interest along it, and then a side trail that led to the observation deck with a loop there at the end to turn around. We had also shown a connection up to the back of the Frick Environmental Center because this trail here is a kind of a gravel trail that has some steep slopes and is not accessible. Concept two was different in some respects. So in this case, the nature discovery space here near the existing nature play area had two gathering spaces that were connected, and it didn't have that loop trail, still had a shade structure. And then we had reconfigured the nature trail area a little bit to provide a more direct and accessible connection to the Frick Environmental Center and the amphitheater, and then a kind of a tighter loop down lower on the hillside that connected to the observation deck. So we had a lot of meetings like this one. We had a public survey. We had meetings with the Parks Conservancy and our advisory committee. And the feedback that we got in general, although people liked lots of things from both options, is that the nature discovery space from concept 2 was preferred, with the 2 gathering spaces, which are very helpful for the Parks Conservancy's programs. In general, it was viewed as a nice feature to have some kind of boundary, not a tall fence, but just something to define the edge of the space, in particular when there are groups of people out there, particularly children. We really wanted to take advantage of the meadow as a sensory feature of that space and provide multiple ways for people to experience it. We heard that a shade structure without a solid roof was not nearly as useful as one that did have a roof. So that's something we've incorporated into both gathering spaces in the refined design. And we also heard that that area would be, a project space. We'd need things like tables and mud kitchen spaces, different types of seating. And it's really important to have those at different heights, to think about how wheelchairs, someone using a wheelchair could use those, people of different ages. So we've really tried to look at that in a holistic way. We heard that the sensory nature trail and observation deck orientation from concept 1 was preferred, giving that sort of bigger loop. And we got a lot of feedback on all the different features we had shown from the 2 concepts and have tried to incorporate all of those into the refined design. Another thing that we've done is provide more resting spaces and benches along that trail, recognizing that it's further from the Frick Environmental Center. It has steeper slopes, and so therefore it's more challenging and you might need more rest along the way. And we also got some great feedback about just providing lots of different ways for people to enjoy those sensory elements along the way, and to make sure, if we're thinking about things like balancing and movement, that we're accommodating people using wheelchairs, for example. So with that, I'm going to do kind of a walkthrough of the revised concept design. And I'm happy to, after we get through some bits and pieces of this, to answer some questions if you have any. Again, this is the overview, very similar to what you saw with the 2 design options. And you can see that this looks very much like the nature discovery space from that concept 2 with 2 gathering areas. We have, this is the current alignment of the South Clayton Loop Trail repaved, connecting into the sensory nature trail that is a single loop. And we've done some more field work to look at existing trees and the best place to put that trail. It connects down to the observation deck here. And there's also a connecting trail to the back of the Frick Environmental Center and some reworking of paths there. And so you can see, just looking overall at the paths in this area, the purple on this plan, which is the area right around the upper part of the Frick Environmental Center, those are the trails and paths that are currently meet accessibility standards. And so with this project, we'll be adding all these trails in orange to make them accessible, meeting trail accessibility standards. So we're really dramatically increasing the amount of accessible paths near the Frick Environmental Center. Trying to move to the next slide. Oh, okay. So I'm going to look first at the nature discovery space and kind of do a walkthrough of that area and all its different features. Actually, I'm going to get to a spot here where I can zoom in a little bit more. So here we have the fountain circle. So if you're coming from the Frick Environmental Center, you would arrive here kind of first before embarking on the other trails in Frick Park. One thing that we're proposing is to repave and slightly regrade and realign the trails that are right beyond the fountain so that those are accessible. Right now they're reasonably flat, but the paving materials are pretty rough. So we'd like to smooth those out. And then that would become the jumping off point for entering the nature discovery space. Also in itself, it would provide a nice little loop to go and visit the meadow. So as you start to approach the space, I just want to note these symbols in blue. We have started to think about where it would be important to provide things like informational and wayfinding signs at kind of the key gateways. And Brandon's going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. This entry path here, along with the sign that's here to mark it as a gateway, it's right on the border between kind of the meadow and the woodland, and really provides a nice overview of both of those environments. There's this really neat dogwood grove that's a part of that space. So we'd enter kind of through the middle of those with a view to the oak trees and woodland beyond, kind of framed by two picnic pavilions that would provide shade. And I'll show some pictures of what those might look like. And as you would walk into the space, you'd immediately feel a difference under your feet because we're proposing potentially to use a permeable paving material that incorporates recycled rubber. It is firm and just slightly springy, and it would sort of give you another tactile sense that you're in the sensory nature space. And as you make your way into the space, there's a wonderful feature that is right near the entrance, which is a garden kaleidoscope. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. But the idea there is to take a little piece of the meadow and bring it a little bit up closer for exploration, both through sight, smell, and touch. So really it's a planter. But that planter also incorporates a framework that has kaleidoscopes at different levels so that you can look through it and see the patterns and colors of the meadow arrayed in a really unique way. And if you've been to the Pittsburgh Botanic Garden, they have one of these, so you may have encountered one before. Let me zoom in just a little bit. And this first gathering space, not letting me move for some reason. My computer gets really finicky when I get on Zoom for some reason. My apologies. Get a little preview of the pictures. Oh my goodness, sorry. Let's try this again. Okay, I'm not going to try zooming because that seems to have thrown everything off. But in any case, I had mentioned the permeable paving material, that kind of springy surface that is the main path here. We would use a different paving for the two gathering spaces, kind of to set those areas apart, and also to be able to incorporate some artistic elements. So that might be something like a colored concrete paving with leaf imprints. This area would be enclosed by a low stone wall that would provide seating. And we'd have a space here for project tables, for lots of different nature discovery activities. And I know it kind of looks like a smiley face. These are two tables with benches, and then this one is a roll under wheelchair accessible table. Moving into the second gathering space, this one also has some tables, and it also has some messy project counters at different heights that could incorporate sort of basins or trays for mixing up mud kitchen materials or for collections. Another feature that would be really useful for nature education and art programming. And we have a little storage shed as well. And between these two spaces, we're going to be right on grade underneath these nice oak trees so that there's room to go out and gather materials and that kind of thing. And this whole area would be enclosed by kind of a stacked rail edge, very similar to that eagle's nest that you saw in some of those previous pictures, to help define the borders of that area for anyone who's in it. And so here's some pictures of some of the features that I described. So this isn't the exact design of the shade structures, but it's kind of a similar type of thing, kind of recalls some of the architecture of the Frick Environmental Center itself. We want to use natural materials in this design as much as possible. So we want to bring in some of that local sandstone that you also see used in Frick Park quite often for our stone seat walls. And we also have the opportunity to incorporate sandblasted artwork, maybe with some of the leaf patterns of the meadow, and same thing with some of the paving. And this is a picture of that garden kaleidoscope I mentioned. And this is the porous paving, rubber paving material I talked about. Here's some images of some of the furnishings that we're envisioning for the space. We've been working with some vendors to develop custom furniture designs that are more inclusive than what is available out there in some of the catalogs. Again, we want to use natural materials as much as possible in keeping with the character of Frick Park. So this is that curved project table that we saw in the plans, which allows a wheelchair to roll underneath it. Same thing with this roll under counter, and we can set this at various heights. So we might have some low ones and some higher ones. We also have more picnic table type project tables. There's also the opportunity, this isn't shown in the plan right now, but potentially we could combine some of these with some catalog mud kitchen items. And then this is an image showing the kind of stacked rail border that I talked about. So it shows similar to split rail fence rails, but they are kind of weaved in with each other, similar as what you saw with the eagle's nest. We could maybe even use on-site material to build those. And we would probably not go very high, maybe just a couple of rails high, again, just to sort of define that space. And these pictures show some of the kinds of activities that would happen there. We really want to provide a lot of flexibility and really the infrastructure for fun programs that use natural materials and not have too much of that prescribed. It's really for the participants to make of it what they can. So, and then here's a picture of the shed that might be a part of this. Storage is pretty important so that we have all those materials close at hand. Okay, any questions about the nature discovery space before I move on to the sensory nature trail? Oops, sorry, again. Trying to get to the right slide. I did see there was something in the chat. Oh, what about dog walking? And you know what, let's address that actually at the end, but we'll remember to get back to that question.
Yeah, Andrea actually has a few questions she started sending me directly that I think would be
very
good to pose to the group because I think they're important. So we can wait to the end.
Okay, wonderful. All right, very good. So looking at a walkthrough of the sensory nature trail, and I'm going to hide my floating controls here. So as you saw in one of the previous plans, the plan is to repave a portion of the South Clayton Loop Trail because right now, although it is a reasonable slope for an accessible trail, the paving is pretty uneven. So we want to smooth that out. And that would lead down to the entrance. This is where the entrance to the nature trail is currently. Right now it splits into two and you can go either way. After evaluating the existing trail, we decided it was best to abandon this loop over here. There are a lot of challenges with big trees that the trail is running right over the trunks of, as well as some steeper slopes, and it gets pretty close to the loop trail here, and there's a lot of cut throughs. So we are planning on creating a new connection down to the lower portion of the trail. As you would enter the sensory nature trail here, we would have a different paving type to signal as you're getting off of the South Clayton Loop Trail, which might be asphalt. And we might have some of that tinted concrete paving at the entrance to kind of give it, to enhance the identity there, as well as some informational signage. And then continuing into and along the path, you would come to an intersection, again, to that trail that goes down the hill that I mentioned. But if you continue forward, you'll come to one of our first sensory stations along the trail. This is the Pebble Harp Station, and I'll, if you haven't encountered one of these before, there's one at the Children's Museum. I'll show a picture of what that looks like. This is really kind of a very low-key musical instrument where you can drop pebbles into slots in the top of it. It makes a wonderful sound as it cascades down. We would provide those at a couple of different heights and also provide a bench in that area for resting. This area, this portion of the trail is quite flat. We have some beautiful trees along the way, along a large oak tree here. But we also have a number of trees that have come down and some openings that we can take advantage of to build some new features. I do want to mention that we'd like to enhance the planting between these two trails where they're close together so that we can have a little bit more screening, not completely opaque conifers or anything like that, evergreens, but perhaps some shrubbier plants through here. Deer are definitely a factor when it comes to planting in this park of Frick Park. The next sensory feature that you would encounter along the trail, and I do want to mention that at each of these areas, we would have a change in paving, again, to sort of signal that you've arrived at a place where there's something more to do with your senses. So we'd have that at the Pebble Harp Station. Again, that would be the tinted concrete with leaf imprints, whereas the main trail would be that permeable material that's kind of springy underfoot, which, by the way, is very good for protecting the roots of trees because it is permeable to air and water. So our next sensory station would be the forest floor exploration. And I'll show a picture of what that might look like as we get further into the presentation. But you can imagine it as kind of a low retaining wall that's built into the hill up above that can bring that forest floor just a little bit up closer to eye level and hand level for exploration. So some of the activities that the Parks Conservancy often does with tree cookie turnovers, with examining fungus on logs, with looking for bugs, with collecting acorns and pine cones, that could be done here. And we would have places that would allow wheelchairs to roll under as well. Of course, we're not only thinking about wheelchair accessibility. That kind of setup would also be very useful for folks who can't bend down or get down on the ground, even folks who might be using walkers. And I'd like to mention too that our little seat wall in the nature discovery space that I described previously could also serve a similar purpose, although it wouldn't be a roll under like this one. So that's going to be a really nice feature along here. Again, we've used some local stone to build that, we're hoping. Now, we also have included some benches in this area where again, this is fairly flat. We have one that's near the forest floor exploration, and then we have one that's a little ways down under this really nice fir tree that's kind of unique in this area of Frick Park. And between these two benches, we would set up a whisper station, which you may have seen at playgrounds. It's also known as talk tubes, where it's kind of two funnels that are connected underground, and you can talk into one and hear from the other. So those two resting stations would be kind of connected with audio, engaging that type of sense. So as you continue along the trail in this direction, it's going to get a little steeper because we're heading down the hill. There is that side trail connection to the back of the Frick Environmental Center. Again, we'd have a change of paving material and a sign to help indicate that if you go on that trail, you're headed to the Frick Environmental Center and you're going to be leaving the Sensory Nature Trail. You might have some boulders along the way to help define the edges of that trail. This part of the trail wraps around some beautiful beech trees. And there is a standing dead tree in this area, kind of a big trunk that is cut off a ways above your head, but not a full dead tree, which might be a neat feature along the way. So heading down the hill, we'll go along the contour, which means it will flatten out in this area. And there's a really nice group of giant red oaks. They're all growing together as a cluster. And so we thought this might be a nice space for kind of a meditation bench to contemplate that tree. And really in this space, you feel like you're kind of immersed in the forest. And as we get back to the intersection with the other part of the loop and the trail down to the observation deck, there's a clearing. And this might be a nice place to have a place for a movement sensory activity. So I'm not going to try to zoom in because it might cause us problems. I do have some images of what that might look like, but just imagine it as kind of a pathway that is made with big stumps, and they're at different heights. We want to provide something like a rope to hold on to as you navigate that. Again, this is a side station off of the trail. You don't have to do it, but it could be something, a really fun balancing activity for kids and anyone of any age. We would also provide some kind of stepping stone type patterns in that surfacing around there, so that if you aren't able to do the log steppers, you can still do some of that same balancing activity on flat ground. And we would also, along the back edge of this, provide kind of speed bumps for in the surfacing for wheelchair users to go over and have some of that same balancing and fun challenge. And this whole space would be surrounded by a seat wall, a low stone wall for seating. We could incorporate, again, some tactile elements in that wall, things like a labyrinth pattern that you could follow with your finger. So you can really get some of that movement, both at a broad scale with your whole body and maybe also at a fine motor skill scale as well. So now I'm going to pretend that we are headed down to the observation deck here, and we're exploring this side trail. Again, a resting space along the way. This is a little bit steeper, this portion of the path, as we're heading down the hill. And it goes very closely around some big trees that are right next to the path. And I should mention that in most places, we are following along the same nature trail path, more or less, but we are trying to make it a little bit wider where we can, generally about 6 feet wide. So this whole upper section is pretty much on the trail the way it is now, as well as this lower section. We're just connecting them in a different way. So going down to the observation deck, this is a really special space in Frick Park, and we heard from many people how much they love to use this space. The Parks Conservancy also uses it for a lot of programming. And it really, we're going to be keeping it the way it is, other than we want to replace the decking. We want to replace the railing, and I'll show you some images of what that might look like. And there's some other fixes we need to do to make sure that the path connects to it without any steps up or dips or lips that are hard to get over. And I'll mention that there is a continuation of the trail this way. We explored whether we could make that accessible, and it was really quite difficult given some of the slopes that were created as part of the building of the Frick Environmental Center. So that will remain, but it will not be accessible. So we'll have, again, a change of paving material and a wayfinding sign. So folks know if they go this direction, it's no longer an accessible trail. So to stay on the accessible trail, you would go around this small loop and go back up to that intersection that we were at before. And continuing in this direction, back up the hill, this is actually pretty flat through here. There's some wonderful big trees. Again, there are some fallen trees that we can repurpose and maybe lay next to the trail as sort of for seating, or to just sort of explore that natural log as it decomposes. And then we have in this clearing where we had some fallen trees, we have the opportunity to do another sensory feature and also make sort of a little gathering area. At the entrance to it, again, we'd have a change in paving to indicate that. This is our timber fort. So it's made out of natural wood. It's kind of an asymmetrical kind of structure, like maybe kind of recalling the kinds of structures that kids build out of sticks in the woods. But on a bigger scale and stronger, with openings that would allow someone using a wheelchair or other assistive device to go into it and use it. It again would be surrounded by a low stone wall for seating. We have some other whisper stations here as well that could be used as part of this space. Again, to add some of that auditory exploration and use of one's senses. This structure is something that would have a lot of sensory potential, just both in terms of being able to touch it, being able to get inside it and get that sense of enclosure. a different, a change in the shadows and patterns on the ground. And we'd also provide a little bump out in the wall that surrounds this with a small bench. And we'd like to build kind of a nest around it, provide a retreat space as a part of this area. It might have something like the stacked rail border that we showed over here, but maybe on a little smaller scale to provide that nest-like feeling. And then to complete our journey on the sensory nature trail, we'd head back up the hill, kind of a steeper segment here, and rejoin the main path where we could make our way back to the Frick Environmental Center.
Kara, just a time check. It's
yes.
6:42, 6:45.
Okay.
So
I will try to get through these images a little bit more quickly.
Sure.
So I think we already looked at some of the paving materials. I just wanted to add that any place where we have the potential for people to climb on something, we provide a soft surface, something that looks natural, but probably would be something like a bonded rubber mulch, which we've used on a lot of projects. Here's an image showing the pebble harp and how we would put a couple of these at different levels with a pebble reservoir for each, which makes a taller one that's good for someone who's standing, might also be good for a larger person in a taller wheelchair, and then also a lower one, which would be great for small children, for people who can get down to this lower reservoir of pebbles. Also very good for folks in a seat using a seated position. And you can actually take pebbles from the upper reservoir and put them in the lower one if your range of motion is limited. Here's a picture of the forest floor exploration concept. We probably want it to look more like this one on the left, with the kind of natural stone with a tray on top of it for roll under. But I wanted to show you an image of how it could be potentially built into the hillside, although these are not the materials that we would use. A word on the benches that are along the trail and those resting spaces. And you may have noticed that we had a kind of ample space next to each bench. So there's room for a wheelchair or other device next to it. We'd really like to reuse some of the fallen wood material that is on site. There are some trees, some white oak trees that came down at different points, and that is a reasonably durable wood material. We have some great wood artists here in Pittsburgh who have made benches like this one at the Highland Park Super Playground, this one at the Pittsburgh Botanic Garden, that really incorporate the natural form of the wood and also wonderful textures that can serve as kind of a nice tactile feature and a beautiful visual form, as well as being good for seating. And here's the Whisper Station. We may also use the City of Pittsburgh standard park bench in some locations. Here are some images of the balance steppers, and there are more images than one, but here they come up on my screen. So this is really the inspiration image, this idea of this path that kind of goes up and down and all around and is a real fun challenge to walk over. But we'd like to add this idea of a rope to it for support, as well as I mentioned, having more stepping stone type features and those speed bumps to roll over. Here's some images of what the timber fort might look like. We're working with a couple different vendors to kind of develop the specifics of this, make sure it's doing everything we want it to do. And then here is a couple images related to the observation deck. One piece of feedback that we got from folks is that the current railings are not great in a few ways. Like number one, they're too low, but also they're very solid, so you can't see through them very well, and they're also climbable. So we'd like to resolve those two issues. We do need to raise the railing up so that it meets the current code. But we did hear from folks who are wheelchair users that a lot of times that height hits right at eye level, the top of that railing. So we want to make this railing as see-through as possible. We would use, I think, a lightweight framework, probably using metal. We may incorporate wood, we may not. And we really like this stainless steel mesh material that's very transparent. We also could use a welded wire mesh type of material. And we also explored incorporating sensory tools like viewing scopes and things like that in this area, and found that the ones that are out there are not necessarily very customizable. So we've been exploring some alternatives. Given that it's the observation deck, we do want to sort of prompt people to use their observation skills and tools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon to wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, and following up on what Kara was saying, one of the things we discovered is in terms of the types of equipment, the physical infrastructure that we can build out there, we can accommodate a lot of folks, but there is no average person. There's no average person with autism. There's no average wheelchair user. So one of the things we're considering doing in order to make the space as accommodating as possible and break down as many barriers as we can to entry to use this space is providing additional sensory or observation tools that we would lend out from the Frick Environmental Center to whoever needs them to help better enhance their experience here. So that would include sensory kits that have things like noise canceling headphones, sunglasses, fidget toys for people who might be hyper or hyposensitive, and providing them some tools to manage their comfort and in order to stay engaged when they're using this space. We're also talking about providing potentially adaptive binoculars, including an image of these really cool Wi-Fi binoculars that broadcast the image onto a phone or a tablet. So someone who can't use binoculars has the ability to look at the same thing that someone else is looking at. Assistive listening devices where you can adjust the frequency to help you hear bird sounds or other sounds if you might have some hearing issues, as well as magnifying glasses, kid-friendly binoculars, etc. Other things that can just help people engage with the space more fully, and is a little more adjustable and customizable for their own kind of level. Next slide, please. And in addition to that, in terms of wayfinding and signage and kind of interpretation of these spaces, we want to provide that flexibility as well. So one of the things we're considering doing is using the city's standard signage for parks, for the regional parks, which are the images you see on your left, which are great because the city has the ability to replace these and update these in-house frequently. But kind of use them for our purposes where we can provide a lot of different types of information on a single sign. And what we're thinking about doing is making, a lighter touch is better. We've heard some of that in the feedback that less is more. It might be nice for people to be able to access one of these spaces and engage with it on their own without any prompting and kind of come to figure it out by themselves, but some people might need a little more information about how to engage. So one of the things we're considering is using the city standard, but incorporating different QR codes that could give you wayfinding, like this image in the middle, telling you where you are, what is ahead of you when you're walking into the space. It might give you some guidance on how to interact with the different features that are there, but it also allows us to layer in other programming as well, such as we can discuss the cultural heritage of these spaces and Native American history of this area and how they may have used Frick Park. We can talk about mindfulness. We can talk about the seasonal changes that occur in Frick Park, and it changes the experience every time you visit. So along with QR codes, there's other technologies such as an app called Voice Maps, where you can download a GPS audio tour that as you are approaching a spot on this tour, it'll start talking to you based on where you are in GPS, which again can be used for, if there are people with visual impairments, that can be used to help them navigate the space in terms of wayfinding, but also, some of these other cultural or different types of programming that we could layer into this project. And one thing to note, in addition to like lending out kind of sensory observation tools, we recognize that not everyone has an iPhone, not everyone has an iPad or an unlimited data plan. So being able to lend out this technology as well is something that we're considering as part of this project to make it as comprehensive and as inclusive as we can. And Okay, I think we're on to the discussion point. So we do have two questions from Andrea that I'd like her to share with the group. But before we do that, we'd like to, just to give you some prompts about some things that, to help you engage with us. We'd love to know what elements that you liked best, what resonated with you the most, what you thought is really good about this project, but also what features of the design need to be more accessible or more inclusive, or what groups are we maybe not considering enough or as much as we should that is apparent to you, but not apparent to us.